Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, April 17th, 2019, and today we're going to be looking at the 2020 presidential election Democratic primary data that recently came out. One poll that shows Bernie Sanders now leading nationwide. This is the first poll to ever show Bernie Sanders leading nationwide when Joe Biden is considered in the poll. And we have a new poll from Morning Consult that shows Joe Biden leading by 8%, so we do have some conflicting data with drastically different sample sizes, so we should have some interesting data to look over today. We have some general election numbers from Emerson in terms of Trump versus Biden, going down actually to Buttigieg. And if we're just looking at a couple of other things, we have a new Sanders versus Trump poll that also shows some interesting results, but then again, it is from Rasmussen Reports, which typically leans a little bit more to the right. We've already covered, talking about Pete Buttigieg doing well in Iowa and New Hampshire, being third place in those states. I'll probably make a separate video discussing it. It's really important that we notice that this candidate somehow went from a nobody to a somebody. I know I say it every video, but it's kind of insane how much he's actually grown in the past couple of months or weeks, actually. But for Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, those people are probably going to be the top two contenders in the presidential race in terms of the Democratic primary. So we're going to discuss them first. Now, the new recent polls from April 14th from Emerson and Morning Consult, I guess the two most recent polls. I actually like that they've added this thing in because I haven't seen this since 2016. I didn't think they had enough data to make this yet, but apparently they do. Interesting, Buttigieg now above other candidates here like Booker and Klobuchar, where he was really not even on the polling numbers whatsoever. But if we're just looking at the data itself, Biden leads by 9.8%, so it's not exactly the worst thing. His lowest point probably would have been around here where he led by only 6.8%. That's the lowest, which is pretty insane considering that he hasn't even announced yet. And I get it. A lot of people saying once he announces and starts talking, his numbers are going to go down. I see that argument, but for right now, he's in the lead. And I don't think that any of this data really will come out too much in terms of the lesser numbers. I do think that this is still going to be a two-way race between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders at the end of the day until we see the debates. But again, these two candidates are probably still going to be at the top. Biden and Sanders both are in double digits, and then it goes down to O'Rourke, Warren, and Harris. Actually, Harris before Warren, Buttigieg, Booker, Klobuchar, and then the list goes on. It's pretty interesting, again, that no candidates before were above 10% except for Kamala Harris, who's actually third place. Now that's interesting. O'Rourke has officially taken over Harris as third place in the 2020 Democratic nom. They've been, neck and neck before. Harris consistently led. Bet O'Rourke before. I think O'Rourke actually led Harris earlier on, but then Harris started to gain a lead. I think this was around Biden's lower ends, and then all of a sudden O'Rourke and Harris tied, and then now O'Rourke is leading Harris. I think that's interesting, but we're getting a little bit off track here. We're focusing on Bernie Sanders leading by 5% in this new Emerson poll. Now that holds some interesting results because we never have seen Bernie Sanders lead, especially by something like 5%. Now Emerson has been a little bit different compared to the rest of the polls. It has been showing the race a lot closer than some of the other data has. In the races that have been close, you see a tie. It's Emerson. If we go over here, it's from Emerson. If we look at some other Emerson polls, I believe 1, 2, and then it goes down to here. It does show Biden leading by 10%. So it goes from Biden plus 10. Actually, no. So this one was completely off. Biden plus 37 with Bernie Sanders in. That did not make any sense. Okay, it never should be that large of a lead for someone like Joe Biden. Back then, it was interesting because we didn't see many inconsistencies with Emerson, but now we're starting to see it just a little bit. Not throwing out this poll completely just because a lot of you are going to say, oh, because I don't agree with its numbers, or I do agree with its numbers, whatever. I'm looking at it from where it compares to other polls, and it's not really matching up. The data isn't necessarily being consistent with what we're seeing. A lot like what we see with the Rasmussen reports with the approval rating of the president. They consistently show him with an approval rating with an higher approval rating than disapproval rating or a tie when all the other pollsters are showing it differently. And again, I could be completely wrong about this. Emerson could be that one outlier, the one that is actually right, like what we saw in 2016 in 3 states in particular out of 50. But if we're just looking at this data right now, it shows Bernie Sanders in the lead, but I don't think that this is a very strong indication of a Biden win in the 2020 Democratic nomination. As soon as I told you guys that I was going to do this video, a lot of you started, hyping up this poll to being something that it's really not. It's not that big of a breakthrough for someone like Bernie Sanders. Sure, he's leading, but you might want to wait until the second or third poll that comes out that shows him leading, and then we can actually start seeing consistent data that shows him leading, and that it's not just an outlier. Again, a lot of people did, bring up the fact that Biden led by 37% over Bernie Sanders, but obviously that poll wasn't correct. I mean, it showed Julian Castro above Bernie Sanders, and that's definitely not correct. And if we're looking at this data here, yes, I do think that this race is getting a little bit closer with Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, but I don't think that Bernie Sanders has yet taken over. This Emerson went from a 10% lead. Actually, it says it here. It shows that Joe Biden before, let's see where I can find it. Okay, in February, he led Sanders 27-17. So that was that 10% lead we saw before. Then it was tied in March, and then now it's April, and now Sanders is a 5-point lead. So I think that it is pretty interesting how, the numbers have changed over time, but I don't think that this is too accurate of an indication of the 2020 Democratic primary. Yes, I am pointing out that Buttigieg does get third place here, but that's something that also isn't consistent with the rest of the data. He is getting third place in Iowa and New Hampshire, which is something to note. But he's getting third place over O'Rourke and Harris here, which does show something interesting, but it's not enough to make a full-on claim that he's third place nationwide until we get more data that actually can average out the rest of the polls to actually agree with what each poll is saying with one another. Again, Emerson did come out with some data in terms of Trump versus various Democrats. Biden leads the pack with the largest lead over President Trump with a 6% lead, goes down to Sanders with a 3% lead, then O'Rourke at a 2% lead. Harris ties with Trump. Buttigieg loses by 2%, and Warren loses by 4%. I think it is interesting, though, that they're throwing Buttigieg into this race because I do think that that could be an interesting race if Buttigieg was the Democratic nominee. But right now, he loses to Trump by 2%. That also could be lack of not knowing the candidate, considering that it didn't seem that there were any undecided voters. I'm pretty sure that they either forced the respondents to answer or there was no, except for the Sanders versus Trump poll, which shows Sanders by 3%, which that really shouldn't happen if all the respondents were forced to answer. But it seems like they didn't really have any other choice because, again, Buttigieg, if that was just randomly thrown out to any American, there isn't really a guarantee that every American would know who he was compared to someone like Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, who in 9 out of the 10 cases would know who those candidates were. But looking at the morning consult poll, like I said before in the beginning of the video, the very beginning of the video, the sample sizes were drastically different. If we're looking at the Emerson poll, let's actually go back to it just to show you the sample size. Let's see it right here, 356 people. So that's not necessarily the worst amount. Generally, a poll should be around 1,000 to look at accuracy. But right now in this morning consult poll, there were 12,550 interviews of registered voters. So these aren't likely voters. These are registered voters. I'm pretty sure they just got numbers off voter rolls and called people throughout the United States, especially Democrats, obviously for the Democratic primary. But right here, Bernie Sanders is behind Joe Biden, and I would trust a morning consult poll over an Emerson poll just based off previous data with Emerson. But morning consult is not exactly the most accurate pollster that I would trust, but I do think that they're pretty accurate in terms of some of the things like in terms of their Trump approval rating state by state, Senate approval rating, governor approval rating, things like that. Early primary state voters, which is not something that they show on Real Clear Politics, but Joe Biden actually leads by a lot larger of an amount than amongst Democratic primary voters in general. Bernie Sanders only goes down by 2%, but Joe Biden actually leaps up by 6%, making his lead 16% over Bernie Sanders. If you are strong early on in these, early voting states, you're going to do pretty well in terms of the rest of the primary, because once you get your name out there, which it's already out there, and you get momentum, it's going to continue. If we look at the Democratic primary voters, they put Pete Buttigieg in 5th place, which is pretty much consistent, tying with Elizabeth Warren, so pretty consistent there. But in terms of the early primary voters, Elizabeth Warren jumps up to 3rd, Beto goes down to 4th, and Pete Buttigieg goes to 5th, topping Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Amy Klobuchar. Now, that could be pretty interesting considering that Pete Buttigieg, again, from Indiana, he doesn't really have an early state to rely on. He's going to be focusing on Iowa and New Hampshire. It's just interesting that these states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada, if we're talking about those 4 states, the ones that they're using up here. But Pete Buttigieg is doing well amongst those states, especially with someone like Kamala Harris, who should be performing well in South Carolina and Nevada, based off where she's from, and maybe not too much in Iowa and New Hampshire, but looking at those states, she definitely should be doing better there. Pete Buttigieg is now topping her there. I do think that there could be a possibility of him actually gaining a lead over someone like Elizabeth Warren or Beto O'Rourke nationwide, but that's, again, another discussion. We're starting to see 2020 generic congressional vote polls. Actually, sorry, I did not wrap up my last few statements, but again, I do trust the morning consult poll just a little bit more. I do think that they do have some interesting numbers, though. I do think that if we do see more Sanders polls showing him the lead, we're going to come back to this one and say, okay, what did this poll actually do right? But for right now, it seems like Biden may actually be, in the lead still nationwide, especially with a consistent lead of around 8% with an average of 9.5%. So 8% would actually be an understatement there. But that 17% poll, which is really skewing up his average, I don't think that one's too accurate, especially in the nationwide poll. I do think that it's more close to the 7-8% range in favor of Joe Biden. But disregarding the 2020 Democratic primary, one thing I forgot to mention is that they are starting 2020 generic congressional vote polls, which show the Democrats ahead by 6.3% on average. If we're looking at the overall data, the Democrats have consistently led. We haven't seen Republicans lead. Emerson started off the polling data with Democrats +2, and we've ended up so far with the morning consult poll of Democrats +3. And the data does change. This is not too important for right now, but once it starts getting down to 2020, the Democratic Party is definitely going to be looking for gains in the House, considering that if you look back to 2006, that was their wave year. They did take the Senate then. They did not take the Senate now. They're going to be focusing on a House and Senate wave for 2020 to have a full-on effect if they are to win the White House too, to have an administration that works with the House and the Senate. So that wraps up today's video. Thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I'll see you all tomorrow.